Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Tomlinson, and I am a postdoctoral researcher with the SDU Metaverse Lab at the University of Southern Denmark, as well as a lecturer with the University of California, Irvine. I figured I would turn my camera on really quick just to say hi, but I'm going to close it out so that I'm not obscuring my own slides, if that's all right. So today I'm going to be talking about my research on the big business of games, framing the gaming landscape within player perceptions and trust. So we know that video games are hugely lucrative. They're more lucrative than a lot of other entertainment industries. We have billions of players worldwide. We have billions of hours spent on video games. And in terms of video games and players, we understand that they're motivated by the satisfaction of play. They're looking for some kind of outcome from play that's going to give them happiness or excitement. And we know that players are also motivated by the promise of relaxation and escapism. In some cases, these can be related to things like being social, but they are also occasionally stressful. And we're going to be talking about some of the more stressful elements of video games and play and community. We also know that there are connections to an interest in video games that can lead to hype among fans. I'm having an issue. Oh, there we go. Things are a little bit slow. I apologize for that. Group dynamics, identity, and fan passions can lead to toxic fan practices. And we know that video games in general, in terms of online play, in terms of online communities and interactions, can also have a lot of toxicity, harassment, hostility, particularly for players from marginalized backgrounds, where players need to find ways to circumvent those behaviors. And that can lead to people muting their mics, only playing with people that they know, only playing certain kinds of games, avoiding some genres or companies altogether. And part of this puzzle is that the industry has been struggling with addressing this problem. They've been trying to find ways to prevent hostilities, to kind of reduce some of the toxicity that we see in online dynamics, but it tends to fall a little bit short. So for the study that I'm going to be talking about today, it's a qualitative study where I use text or content analysis, depending on your field and background. And I applied this to social media and online forum discussions. Data was collected between September of 2016 and November of 2023, and this was based on online observations of players talking to one another. I used both general gaming spaces and game-specific spaces, and some of these game-specific spaces were informed by what I saw in those general gaming spaces. So games that were coming up pretty frequently in terms of people talking about excitement, talking about disappointments, talking about things that have burned them in the past. So in addition to those general spaces, I also looked at The Sims, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, Cyberpunk 2077, Baldur's Gate 3, Overwatch, Starfield, and Assassin's Creed. For the actual coding, I used an open coding scheme, and I applied a grounded theory approach because I wasn't going into this with specific questions about trust, but this is what emerged from the analysis based on the observations that I made. So using this approach allowed the themes to emerge from these conversations naturally or organically and produce the patterns that I'm going to be discussing in the analysis. So one of the things that was really common and increasingly common over time were conversations about game trailers, hype, and pre-ordering. These are things that players have become increasingly tense about. There's a lot of kind of pulling in either direction among players who are talking about video games, their excitement, and also their disappointments. There's a growing distrust that trailers are honest. And we see a lot of conversations that highlight this as manipulative. Players have increasingly started to talk about game trailers as not really showing the video game content, not really giving you an idea of what the game experience is going to be like, but instead just being a polished, pretty movie that's supposed to generate hype. So we see a lot of sense that companies are not really being honest. And part of this has resulted in increasing calls not to pre-order games, not to give money to the company before promises are actually met. And these group dynamics have created a bit of a culture of caution, but players do produce personal rules and may have exceptions. So there's been kind of a list of companies or video games that players generally feel a little bit more positively toward, a little bit more comfortable with. It was very interesting gathering this data because Cyberpunk 2077 was one of those games that shifted from a trusted company and a trusted game to one that was very explicitly not trustworthy. So there was a lot of sense that CD Projekt Red was a company that always delivered, could be trusted, would be honest about video game content and gameplay, had been kind of faithful to the players. And once Cyberpunk 2077 was released, that conversation flipped completely. And suddenly they were on the other side of a lot of this tension and anger. So I have one quote here that kind of talks about this sense of dishonesty, what companies could do better to actually show players what to expect. One user says, "I remember playing Arkham Asylum in a store, and the combat mechanic alone impressed me. You just need a simple demo that shows off what can be done in the game. That's the best possible way to show and not tell." There's my 2 cents. Not all developers can make demos, but they can at least show actual gameplay footage and not a pretty CGI movie. Despite this distrust, though, there's still excitement over trailers. This is still pretty common. You see hype being generated. And these conversations do present some of that community tension. So people will be excited, they'll start to get hyped, and then suddenly you see a lot of comments that are cautioning them, reminding them, well, this information may not be accurate. You might be excited based on something that's not even real. And so we see those calls for more accurate pre-release representation of games. We also see a lot of players talking about learning from mistakes. They remind one another, well, remember what happened with this game? We were excited about it and then we got burned because people weren't being honest. Two of the games that were the most common focus of that were actually No Man's Sky, kind of recalling that experience, and also Cyberpunk 2077. So we have a quote here that kind of illustrates part of this experience for players. "Pre-ordering used to serve a purpose, but that purpose is almost gone, and the only reason it's still a thing is because publishers want all of the money up front so they can use trickery and hype to make it seem necessary. Pre-order exclusives, yeah, they want you to shell out money without thinking about it or doing research. Then, even if the game is horrible, they still got your money." Another theme that comes up with these discussions and a lot of these tensions and discomforts has to do with monetization and splitting content up. So players are increasingly shying away from and calling out monetization in video games. And this is linked to some suspicions that this is delaying productivity. It's actually preventing creativity and moving forward and progress with games. And one of the major games that's discussed in this context and sort of used as evidence by players is GTA 5. We finally have an announcement for GTA 6, but for a long time, there was a sense that because GTA 5 is so monetized and so able to continue producing revenue, that this is the reason that games are not moving forward. And players often identify things like microtransactions as specifically exploitative. We see a lot of wording of manipulation, exploitation, predation. There is a tendency for players to frame this in a very adversarial way. So I have a very long quote for you highlighting some of these sentiments among players. So with EA, Battlefront 2 was the last straw. Some of us knew about the exploitation and predation. Thanks for showing enough outrage to make the masses aware. For several years, we've known about the predatory and exploitative nature of microtransactions. There's been deterioration of trust regarding pre-orders. I used to have no problem pre-ordering upcoming games because I had faith that the developers were passionately trying to provide an experience they could be proud of. But now we've seen the systemic disregard in terms of quality, and it's led to thinly veiled mass marketing cash grab. Content is also worse. No longer do you have a full, satisfying, complete game that doesn't lack content, less for more. When we reacted mildly, DLC became season passes, doubled the cost of the original game. Season passes weren't enough. Clearly, money is being left on the table, with some people willing to spend thousands. So DLC became microtransactions. Now there's legalized, possibly underage gambling and psychological exploitation of inherent human addictive behavior, full stop. Even though there are these very negative perceptions and very negative conceptualizations of what the industry is doing and what these movements toward monetization mean, we do see celebration of games that players feel like aren't falling into those traps or patterns. So players were very excited, for example, about Baldur's Gate 3 from Larian Studios as an example of a successful, fun-to-play full game that was released without this movement toward microtransactions or different monetization models. that was satisfying and made players recall their older experiences of games. So as I said before, there is this kind of list of companies that get a pass that players are still comfortable with, but it seems to be being whittled down as time moves forward. There's also a lot of concern around some specific game series that come up as part of these conversations in terms of worries about monetization or confirmed movements toward monetization. And these all happen to be under EA, and I don't know if that is a particular trend. I will note that Ubisoft is another company that comes up a lot, particularly in regard to trailers. But for monetization, these are the games and kind of the larger company that people really focus on. So The Sims, Mass Effect, and Dragon Age either are discussed in terms of their monetization or in terms of fears about movements toward monetization. And we have a quote here talking about one of the releases from The Sims, where it was an extra pack that you could purchase for a little bit more content. So they say, "I can't wait to make an amazing farm just to realize the animals only make noise and give product. $20 says the cow. Cow's just a small building with tiny fences and you can just milk and feed it." And so this is the idea that the content isn't actually gameplay. It's another cash grab, as they typically refer to it, that's just trying to generate revenue and not really giving the player anything real. Another worthy theme that comes up has to do with perceptions of safety and experiences with safety. So players identify gaps in their experience and difficulties with companies. More players are discussing taking safety matters into their own hands, feeling like the companies aren't actually contributing anything to protecting players, whether that's protecting them from in-game toxicity or protecting them from other types of inter-player exploitation, like being hacked or having things stolen from their account. There's a general sense of companies not doing enough or not doing the right things to protect players. And this goes back to a lot of what players are kind of presuming or perceiving the motivations of companies to be. Everything seems to come back to, if this is lucrative for the company, that's a decision that they will make. Because safety is not lucrative, it's not something that companies are invested in. So I have a couple of quotes here, one having to do with a hacking incident and another having to do with trying to have those self-protective avoidance behaviors that we increasingly see. So in the first quote, "Someone hacked my PSN account and spent $500 on my card. Sony dragged it out for a month and kept promising a full refund, but then told me the only thing I could do was a chargeback. So I issued the chargeback and Sony disputed and inexplicably won." Eventually, that user actually got their money back, but it was a very drawn out, very concerning experience for them. And a lot of people in the comments on this one also agreed that they had had terrible experiences with the company. There's also a quote, "When there are only shitty players and people complaining about shitty players, people somehow wonder why more players either choose single player games or just play with real life friends." There's also a lot of frustration about having to encounter toxicity during gameplay, when again, this is something that people are trying to do for relaxation, for fun, and a lot of these experiences really take away from that. So in conclusion, there's an increasing amount of distrust among players toward game companies. Words like manipulation, exploitation, predation, these appear more frequently in conjunction with trailers and movements toward monetization models. We do still see that there are some game companies that get passes, things that are being done in players' minds that are correct, that are supportive of players. Going back to Baldur's Gate 3 and Larian Studios, there's a lot of celebration for how open the company has been and how communicative they've been and how reactive they've been to what players have said about the games, in comparison to something like Starfield, where players have really felt left behind by Bethesda. Like Bethesda sees their complaints, sees their comments, and really just kind of brushes them off without taking it into consideration. So some companies are getting praised for not following the march toward monetization, but there is a lot of fear that more companies are going to be falling into this model. And safety is also a concern for players and compounds a lot of the negativity and distrust in companies that we see who don't seem like they're working for the better of the players. So thank you very much. I'm excited to hear any questions that you might have. Here's a list of references that's only going to be here for a second, but that is what I had for you today.
Thank you so much, Christine. There's a question that just popped up from Tulai. Hi, Tulai. I'm curious why the majority of games that were selected for the research were RPGs versus some of the games or communities that might have more toxicity issues like League of Legends or Battlefield.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that part of that might be player expectations. This was based on which games were coming up as sort of the most active or most interactive conversations during the data collection. For some reason, a lot of the conversations about things like League of Legends or Battlefield are not the ones that players were talking about as frequently in these general discussions. Part of that is probably, and I've done studies on League of Legends before, they're a little bit more housed within their own online spaces. And part of it was also probably that some of these things are current or upcoming or anticipated releases, which would mean that people were talking about it a little bit more and a little bit more frequently with a little bit more potential backlash or pushback given the expectations that they had or the expectations that they had were shattered potentially. So I think that that explains a little bit of what this sampling result was.
I have a question. Maybe you mentioned it, but I'm doing my housekeeping at the same time, so sometimes I'm not paying attention fully. How many participants were in the study?
So to kind of do this in the most ethical way possible, I didn't actually select any usernames. I didn't follow any particular players. This was just based on posts themselves. So the posts themselves, based on how long I was doing this for, thousands of posts and comments. The users, though, I'm not sure of. I deliberately avoided collecting any specific user information to hopefully protect privacy and make it so that people wouldn't be identifiable.